And she's been a politician for nearly 4 decades, for goodness sake. Let's meet with Jonny Gould, who's a man on the team sheet here at TalkTV, of course, a regular broadcaster, a man of proud Jewish heritage, and a guy I'd like to call a friend because I've known him for about 20 years. How are you, Jonny?
Good friend, Ian. Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm good as gold. I think you wrote one of the most powerful responses I think I've ever seen to any kind of politician either opining or sharing their views. And I think maybe you could read to us, I'm sure you've got it there, what it was you did write, because I think when she explained, and part of her thinking in her explanation, as you know, was that Jewish people didn't, so white people, there's points of difference, they encounter prejudice, but it's not the same thing. It's true there are many types of white people with a point of difference, like redheads. Why introduce that? But they're not, didn't spend all their lives subject to racism. Pre-civil rights America, Irish, Jews and travellers were not required to sit at the back of the bus. And you responded with your tweet.
I did indeed, and this was in the red-hot moment of her sudden apology, and I thought, I'm not going to let her do this. My tweet, and it's still being retweeted, it's gone viral to a certain extent. My middle-aged great-grandparents weren't required to sit at the back of a bus, but somewhere inside an overpacked cattle transporter instead, without food, water or ventilation, for a 497-mile trip from Vienna, where they lived, to Chelno extermination camp, where they were murdered on arrival. And that was not to compete with what she said. And I really must make this point today. The purpose of this is not to compete with our different forms of racism. And I think what I want to preface this comment with is to say that I find black racism repugnant. I talk to black male friends who, when they're just ambling down the street, minding their own business, people cross the road from them to avoid them. A friend of mine helped up an older lady in distress. She said, "Get off me." It was a moment of racism for my black friend. So we encounter different forms of racism. So I will not let the race baiters divide us, fellow minorities, or indeed all of us as British people who have an equal stake in our society. Racism is terrible, full stop. I just wanted to make the point that the back of the bus thing and her misunderstanding or knowledge, lack of knowledge or refusal to acknowledge is bringing back all the very worst kinds of Corbyn-based anti-Semitism that was so pervasive in his leadership of the Labour Party.
Absolutely spot on. And, I think of over the last couple of years when we've been discussing this, the kind of David Baddiel stuff, I don't agree with Baddiel on many things politically, but the whole Jews don't count thing really does come to life, doesn't it? At points like this. The Diane Abbott comment is precisely what he was talking about.
Indeed, and Sir Keir Starmer has to take action, not least because he has to distance himself from the regime which he was very much part of, know. And as I said to Kevin yesterday in the red-hot moment of this crisis, if you like, of what anti-Semitism and what racism is, this very idea that there are hierarchies of racism has got to come to an end. Yeah. We have to coalesce around multi-ethnicity, if not multiculturalism. Those are difficult words, and they are different meanings without getting too wonkish about them. But we have to get away from dividing each other using identity politics. This era has to come to an end.
Yeah. There's an insanity, a malaise, isn't there, that's underpinning our world, and it's not a comfortable place to be right now. Just explain one thing, Jonny. I know a lot of people, I noticed, again, it's social media. I know you've answered this question many times before. People say, well, Christians aren't a race, Muslims aren't a race. Why are Jews a race? Therefore, it's not racism. Now, that is not true, but could you explain why that's not true for those who are perhaps new to that particular concept?
look, it's an identity, it's a religion, it's a way of life. Strictly speaking, it's not a race, but racism is an act of prejudice against an ethnic group. It's a nationality. It's all sorts of problems, isn't it? Being a Jewish person or a person of an ethnic minority, but also, I mean, to be a white British person appears to have its minority difficulties in this crazy day and age. And one of the things I was so proud of being as a person who grew up British in this country was being part of this country and of a narrative, actually, in which I was extremely great. We came from a generation of people whose lives were literally saved from Nazi tyranny, and we were able, my grandparents were able, they weren't exactly spring chickens, but in their mid to late 30s, to build a life here, to build a small business, to get a mortgage, you know. My grandfather also won the pools. That was nice.
All right. You never told me that before. That's fantastic.
He spent it on a brand new fridge, a black and white television, and driving lessons.
Brilliant.
All here. All life is here in the mid-50s. And, you know, from then on, you know, a couple of generations down the line, I've been able to become a broadcaster and part of the gang. And that's what being British is. And suddenly that rug is pulled away from me when Corbyn is elected as opposition leader. And that, I'm going to tell you, Ian, it was a really scary time. So that, you know, when I am part of the TalkTV family and when I'm on air amongst my friends like you, I mean, I've known you even longer than 20 years.
That's true.
28 years.
28 years.
It's almost to the day.
We were 10, weren't we, at the time? I remember.
We were 10.
Little whippersnappers.
Perhaps even younger. But it's all part of British values, and I think if we can coalesce around those slightly different British values, but nevertheless our island story, then we'll all be much happier than in this way of saying, well, you're this and you're that, and I'm not this and I'm not that. We've got to get away from that era.
Do you think that Labour still have this problem? I know, and, you know, Starmer has done a lot, and he's been mostly credited for that purge, but they are still there. We know who they are on the back benches, those that are still wedded to the idea. And I come back to the, you know, I was just giving that example of the cartoon thing that Corbyn had printed, the hook-nosed banker image from ages ago. It's that kind of stuff, and these guys don't seem to see that as being a problem. So that's why I think it's quite hard to get them around the table on this, because they don't see the problem in the first place.
I would suspect they do, but
when I get a phone call, Jonny, and this happens, sorry to interject, I can remember, and this has happened 2 or 3 times when I've been debating this, somebody will say something like, and this goes back to the Badil comment, they'll say something like, why are you defending Jews? They're doing all right. And it's that, right? They're doing all right. So there's a whole collective where everybody is in the same position, running things, the banks, Hollywood. You know, I know you're very influential, Jonny, but even you don't stretch that far.
Look, you know, I'd be hosting the breakfast show, wouldn't I? At TalkTV if I really controlled things. And the nighttime show. And the lunchtime show.
You'd be here now. Yes, it would just be you.
Yeah, it would just be me. And then someone else could come on, one of my mates.
Absolutely.
Look, Sir Keir Starmer, you know, has presented himself in the middle of the Labour Party, and you know, he's not an anti-Semite. He's not a racist. He's a modern guy. But my criticism of him is expedient more than ideological. I mean, he hasn't swept through the Labour Party and annihilated all of the racists. What he's done is, whenever it's appeared, it's whack-a-mole. Okay, so there are plenty of people around the opposition front benches who are problematic about Jewish people. It's just that they haven't had a letter printed in the Observer, and he has to draw a line. You have to actually wonder whether Labour are electable when this problem clearly has been shown to still exist in quite number in the Labour Party.
Indeed. Jonny, thank you for just sharing those thoughts with us. It's more than appreciated. And if you haven't seen that, I just think that tweet that we mentioned that Jonny posted was just such a very powerful, very accurate reminder of why what Diane Abbott said was demonstrably wrong.